Sir Bradley Wiggins was weighed down by addiction and depression. That was until he went to visit his hero Lance Armstrong in Aspen, Colorado. Wiggins' revelations in his new book The Chain will make you see him in a completely different light. He talks about his runaway father, a former cyclist who told Bradley that he'd never match up to his dad. He reveals how his former coach, who he looked up to, abused him as a child. And he spoke about how addiction to cocaine gripped every part of his being. Yes, Wiggins is revered for winning 8 Olympic gold medals, but you don't know him until you've watched this video. Then you can read The Chain and see for yourself what you think. In this video, I'll discuss the main themes in the book and give you my honest thoughts on it. This video will contain references to child abuse, so if you don't want to hear that, please click away now. So Wiggins is the son of Gary Wiggins, who was a former European track cycling gold medalist who had a mindset as cold as ice. He had a reputation as being a loose cannon and a bully. His standoffish personality was reflected in how Gary and Bradley only really connected when Bradley was in his late teens. Gary made plenty of enemies in and out of cycling and was eventually murdered in 2008, left for dead in a ditch in Aberdeen, New South Wales. Now, Bradley's conflicted feelings about his father and his own identity are really threads which run through this book. On one hand, he wanted to compete with the same fury that his father had, but he also resented his father for leaving him. It's that lack of closure which I think probably led to Bradley's struggles with addiction to cocaine and depression later on in life. Of course, there was a time when Gary would ring Bradley at all hours of the day in a state of drunkenness and demand money for alcohol. Gary was also once jailed for beating someone with a baseball bat. That darkness would also come through in how Gary would actually supply cyclists with amphetamines, earning the nickname the Doc. So while Gary was undoubtedly a flawed character who was massively impacted by multiple failed marriages, he once told Bradley, "You'll never be as good as your old man." I mean, what a brutal thing to say to your own kid. So here was a man who was just fueled by ego and really lacked a sense of emotional intelligence. While Bradley grew up without a role model, he was also abused by one of his coaches as a junior, Stan. The coach would drug the cyclist and abuse him in his sleep. Of course, Stan saw Bradley's vulnerability and lack of self-esteem and really played off of that. Stan was, according to Bradley, the first person to ever make him feel like he had some sense of self-worth. It's these passages which make the book so shocking and candid, and is definitely one of the darkest sports books I've ever read in my life. Given the trauma Bradley experienced as a child, it's no surprise that he spiraled towards drugs as an adult. Indeed, cocaine consumed him and led to his divorce. And it was only when cycling's real pariah, Lance Armstrong, lent his help that Bradley started to turn his life around. Armstrong booked Bradley a flight to Aspen, Colorado, and when Bradley missed a flight because he was drunk the night before, Armstrong urged Bradley to cancel his hotel and stay with him at his house. So they talked things through, and Armstrong told Wiggins of how he actually quit drinking alcohol 6 months earlier and now had much more of a sense of clarity. Armstrong told Wiggins, "We'll get through this together." The two ran and cycled together, and this was really the beginning of Wiggins' sobriety. Wiggins said, "Life has come full circle again. Like the kid I once was, I'm excited about cycling again." Wiggins then attended Cocaine Anonymous meetings, rising up from a time when he actually snorted cocaine off of one of his Olympic gold medals. He talks of when there was once a time when cocaine would make him feel like he could walk through walls. And I was just thinking, I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall as Armstrong and Wiggins talked about their recovery and life and addiction. It must have just been so sort of cathartic for both of them. There were times when both of these guys were, two of the most rich, powerful and famous sportsmen on the planet. And here they were trying to claw themselves back from rock bottom. And it's well known that Armstrong was basically like a hero to Wiggins. So it must have been incredible for Bradley to have him almost as a crutch to kind of lean on when he really was at his lowest ebb. Wiggins also doesn't really judge Armstrong for doping, and I actually really respect that. Yes, Armstrong lied for so long, and it was a dreadful thing that he did. he manipulated people and he bullied people. But really, I think, everyone has made mistakes. It's not like he was a terrorist or anything like that. And I think sometimes we need to remember that about Lance. So I also feel like Armstrong and Wiggins are definitely people who've kind of crumbled in the public eye. At the height of Wiggins' fame in 2012, when he became the first man to win the Olympics and the Tour de France in the same year, the press really latched on to Bradley, didn't give him any privacy, and just followed him everywhere, to the point where they basically camp outside his house. It got to a point where he just couldn't have a normal life, like do things like go to the shops, do the school run, and the police actually came to his house and asked the press to leave him alone. I really felt for Wiggins because he just wanted that normal life, but he was under such scrutiny 24/7 that he actually had to ask his kids to keep their curtains permanently closed. And at that young age, they were just thinking, like, why do we need to do this? They just didn't understand. And yeah, I think definitely, for Wiggins as a father's point of view, I think that would have been really, really upsetting for him. We've heard this kind of thing in the UK for years and years, going back to things like the phone hacking scandal. And I just think sometimes the way the press treats celebrities is just really, really poor, to be honest. I think it really damages their lives and their mental health, of course, as well. Wiggins said that although after the Olympics in 2012, he was one of the most famous people in the country, he just didn't know how to act, how to talk, or how to be confident. Because of his vulnerability and lack of self-worth, Wiggins just started to dress ever more elaborately, almost to mask how depressed he was feeling. He would wear mod suits and later scooped up deals with Fred Perry and Ben Sherman. He was beginning to be portrayed as a bit of a Jack the Lad character. He hung out with Oasis and also appeared on stage with Paul Weller. He was also photographed outside pubs, drinking and smoking cigarettes. And again, this was something that the papers just latched onto. And this was because no one taught him how to live with the limelight. It's not like being a Premier League footballer where from that young age, if you have a good inkling that you're going to be a success, these are massive clubs and they will guide the players in how to deal with these things. I also don't feel like Team Sky covered themselves in glory with how they responded to Wiggins' struggles with his mental health. He once wrote to Team Sky and told them how low he had sunk, and they replied basically saying to pull himself together. Team Sky was so transactional about winning, and you feel like athletes were never allowed to enjoy their successes. Men in particular were just taught to be, macho, stiff upper-lipped. And I think that really coloured Bradley's view of what a man should be like. So one sentence which really sums up the book is that Wiggins actually claimed that cycling was like a drug. He said it gave him so much, but also took so much away from him. The chain is just a warts and all description of how cycling steered him to self-destruction. He's also so transparent about how he used drugs to really cope with retirement. As you read the book, you can also really empathise with how the drugs basically took over Bradley's personal life and impacted his family life so much. For instance, when Bradley found out that his son had been in a car crash, he was actually high on cocaine. And that, along with the intervention from Lance Armstrong, was actually one of the moments that made Wiggins really turn a new corner and make better choices with his life. And given Gary Wiggins struggles with addiction to alcohol, it's no surprise that Bradley actually confronted his own demons in terms of addiction to drugs. And throughout the book, Bradley really struggles to come to terms with his own identity because of that lack of relationship with his father, and also the conflicting stories about his father that he would hear from his mother. Plus, former cyclists would tell Bradley how much he reminded them of Gary. So he'd flip between worshipping his dad and hating him for the destruction that he'd caused. So really, I just think, who would want to be a sports person? This is one of those books which tells you everything about sport they don't want you to know. The pressure, the lack of safeguarding, the lack of compassion, and the way that society just fails to guide athletes into a sustainable retirement. And I would definitely categorise this book as probably one of the most harrowing and upsetting sports books I've ever read. So although it was written really beautifully and it was gripping and it flowed so well, it's quite difficult for me to say I really enjoyed the book. So there you have it. That's my thoughts on the book. Really hope you enjoyed listening to this today, and see you soon.